faces as well. I'm glad to see some familiar faces. Let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Brian, and I'm currently serving as a pastor of BEM Kuching Evangelical Church, which is in Kuching. I don't know if anyone here is from this part of Malaysia. If you are, to just say hi. And let me quickly explain maybe my connection to Australia as well. I didn't actually study in Australia as an undergraduate. I actually studied in the UK, so I don't quite share the same experiences as many of you. But I did head down under when I went to do my when I went to Bible college. So when I went to Australia back in, I think, when was it now, 2013 to 2015, and I spent 3 years in Sydney. And for one of those years, I spent it at Focus International Church, which I know some of you are or were at. So that's my connection with Australia. Now, I don't actually have a PowerPoint as well, but I trust that you have an outline in front of you. I'm not very big on PowerPoints, although now I feel a bit insecure because I was like, wow, everyone else, Mike's PowerPoints are like really slick and everything. But as long as you have the outline in front of you, that will help you to follow along. Now, I'm also notoriously bad with timings. So I hope that I've not too little or more likely too much. So I'll try not to overrun. I can see the clock is ticking already. It's already heightening my anxiety levels. But let me just begin now. Let me just quickly pray, I think, and then we'll just dive straight into it. So Father, we just thank you again for all the people who are gathered here. We thank you for the opportunity to learn a little bit more about anxiety. And I just pray now that as we tackle this subject of anxiety, I pray that you will be speaking to us and helping us to just be able to look at it from your perspective. All this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, the first thing you can tell me maybe a little bit is, tell me, do you ever get anxious? What do you worry about? Maybe you can just tell me in the chat. Does the chat function work? Yeah. Just tell me a little bit in the chat. It's probably the quickest way. What do you get worried about? Work, yeah. COVID, yeah. That's clearly an obvious one to get worried about. Yep. Okay, Joy says, when I need to see a patient in a hospital, feedback to my superior, uni assignments, relationships, getting older, meeting expectations, added responsibilities. Yep. So some of you name certain situations. Some of you name certain categories, right? Yep. Those are all kinds of things that you get worried about, isn't it? Whether they are exams, getting a job, getting sick with COVID, or maybe your loved ones getting sick with COVID. This week, I actually just had to take a COVID test because one of my congregation members tested positive, and I was in contact. So that got me worried for a little bit. Thankfully, it came back negative. Yep. Health, money, all those kind of things. Some of you name bigger categories, things like, I think somebody said being older and meeting expectations. Yep. Some people might say being alone, I've heard people say that before, all my friends are getting married, but I'm going to be left behind. I'm worried about that. Some people say, I'm worried about living a meaningless life, that kind of thing. So we've got all these kind of things that we worry about, isn't it? We're worried about our present circumstances, our work project and things like that. We're worried about our future state, what's going to happen in the future. We're worried about our desired outcomes being unmet. We have this desire for this outcome, but we're worried that that outcome wouldn't actually be fulfilled. And maybe we're worried about things to do with our identity, things that mentioned that are related to the question, who am I really? So those are all possible things that we get worried about. Let me just share another little quick experience, a recent experience of mine with worry and anxiety. I actually originally started prepping for this webinar back in mid-December. I actually knew that I didn't have much time to prepare for this webinar. So I had a little bit of time sometime in the middle of December. So I spent one Friday afternoon just writing an outline for this webinar. And it took me a bit of time to kind of think through what I wanted to say, to sketch it out. But by the end of the afternoon, I looked at my piece of paper and I thought, oh, okay, that will work. I'm generally quite satisfied with it. So I put that piece of paper away for a while, and I said, okay, after the new year, I'll come back and work on it. But Christmas came and went, and then New Year came and went, and then I found I had that day where I was scheduled to work on this again, and then suddenly I realized I couldn't find that piece of paper where I had just written this outline. So I searched high and low. I looked for all the places where I normally file things, but I just couldn't locate it. And as I was just hunting around for this piece of paper, here were some of the thoughts that were running through my mind. Oh man, how am I going to find the time to rewrite this talk and think about the outline again? It took me quite a bit of mental energy, and right now I'm quite low on mental energy. How am I going to do this now? And then another thought that was running through my mind was, man, how could I be so forgetful? How could I be so careless? Maybe I left it on the floor. I left it on the table and it fell to the floor, and then maybe the cleaner picked it up, threw it in the rubbish or something. And oh no, why am I so stupid? I can't even remember my outline. I can't remember what I actually wrote a few weeks ago. That's so silly. And now I don't have enough time and energy to prepare. So now I know I'm not going to do a good job. So I'm going to look stupid to all the participants. Man, how am I going to ensure that my reputation isn't damaged? Oh man, I'm going to let the impact committee down because I'm going to be disappointing people. I'm going to do such a lousy job. And they're going to feedback to the future committees. Don't invite Brian back. Oh man, that's terrible. You can see that it's pretty ironic that in writing a webinar on dealing with anxiety, I was having such a hard time dealing with my own anxiety. But I just wanted to begin by sharing this experience because I wanted to get across this experience of worry and anxiety is actually universal to all of us. We are all worriers. So my life and your life might not be the same. My stage of life and your stage of life are probably not the same, but we all worry whether it's over different things. So I just wanted to say that when I'm speaking to you today, I'm actually speaking to you as a fellow worrier, as someone who is also presently and wrestling with dealing with my own anxiety. So in one sense, I'm also speaking to myself as much as to you guys. But let me just tell you a little bit about where we're going, or where we're heading in this afternoon. Really 3 parts. I think you can see that on your outline. Firstly, we're going to just think a little bit about what anxiety is exactly and how that works. And then I'm just going to offer you a typical definition of anxiety. And we're going to work off that definition and use that to unpack a little bit of the experience of anxiety. But then after that, I'll kind of thicken the definition a little bit. I'll say that, all right, that's kind of how anxiety works. But then as a Christian, how should we actually kind of add another layer or another dimension to how we typically think of anxiety? So we'll build on that. And then after that, we'll examine some ways our distorted thoughts or our distorted beliefs might contribute to anxiety. And then finally, at the end, thirdly, we'll think about how we can deal with anxiety as a Christian. So that's where we are going. But maybe let me just ask you, and don't look at your handout just yet. Could you just give me a very short 1-sentence summary of what you think anxiety is? I can put it in the chat, maybe. What do you think anxiety is? Okay, we got a couple of replies now. Hayden says fear and worry about uncertainties in life. Okay. Alison says worries as well, to the point that it affects you physically. Oh, okay, yep. Uncertainties comes up again in Olivia's definition. Benjamin uses the word overthinking. Outcomes of situations. Joy says fear or something, even if it's inevitable. Zoe talks about mental preoccupations, which are unhelpful. Anyone else? Those are some, yeah, I'm already noticing certain themes in some of the stuff that's been said. Irrational, fear, false expectations appearing real. Again, the word fear has come up quite a few times, isn't it? Right. Great. Now, when I prepared for this webinar, I just look at a couple of random websites, those medical websites or websites dealing with mental health. And I noticed, I look at their definitions, and I noticed they more or less were saying roughly the same things. So I came up with my own definition, which is a composite of what these websites said. And this is what I came up with. In your outline, it says that anxiety is the reaction of the mind and body to a perceived situation that is stressful and dangerous, whether real or imagined. And I think some of you picked up on some of those themes already in your definitions. I think some of you mentioned what you think, the thoughts that you had. Some of you, I think someone, Alison said how it affects you physically. Well, we're going to think about that in a moment. And then some of you talk about outcomes or uncertainties, you're thinking about this particular situation or circumstance that you're in, right? And you're not sure how it's going to play out, right? So all those things, all those themes are things that we're going to pick up. But now let me work through this definition a little bit more systematically, right? Now, again, if you look carefully at this definition, you will notice that this definition could probably fit another emotion as well. And some of you actually name that emotion. And that emotion is fear, isn't it? When I said anxiety is the reaction of the mind and body to a perceived situation that's stressful and dangerous, whether you imagine, right? You could actually easily apply that to fear. And I think that's because anxiety is really a subset or a species of fear. So you could actually file anxiety under the larger category of fear, right? And sometimes some people, if they wanted to be really precise, right, they will actually suggest that there is a spectrum. And on this spectrum, it goes according to your intensity of feeling. So on one end of the spectrum, you have nervousness, right? And then nervousness will slowly intensify into worry, and then into anxiety. And then kind of at the further end of the spectrum, you have terror and horror, right? And all that is kind of, all that can come under the category of fear. So that's fairly precise. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm not going to be so precise in my definitions. I'm just going to use the word worry and anxiety interchangeably. So if you hear me say worry and anxious, I mean the same thing. Okay? But just to let you know about that. But let's come back to this definition and let's think about how anxiety works. Now, notice that first of all, that like all emotions, anxiety actually has a physical component to it. It affects your body, right? So it's the reaction of the mind and body, right? So let me just take a slightly more extreme example. Imagine that your car has just stopped on a railroad track. You hear a whistle, you look up, and you can see that a train is heading right straight for you. Now, as your body begins to register these facts, your body automatically goes into overdrive. Your brain receives the warning that danger is imminent, and it immediately commands your body to release some hormones, including adrenaline, right? So as a result, your muscles begin to tense up to prepare for action. Your heart rate and your breathing will quicken to supply you with extra oxygen, and you'll probably move quicker than you ever thought possible. Your mind and your body work together in tandem to react. So your feelings of fear are embodied. It has effects on your body, right? And you can see that's a fairly extreme example, and you can see that really I'm talking about fear at that point. But anxiety works like that too, doesn't it, right? Although maybe not quite as heightened a level. So think of how you feel before you take an exam that you're not sure that you're adequately prepared for. Or maybe you know that you've got a really important job interview before, and the interviewer has a reputation for being, super tough. And so just before the exam or the interview, right, often, isn't it, your heart starts to beat faster. You might find your sweat breaking out. You find that you cannot concentrate on what your friends are saying around you. Sometimes you might have a dry mouth. You have nervous energy. So what's happening is that your anxiety is embodied, right? It has an impact on your body. Now, secondly, anxiety also has a behavioral component to it, right? Your anxiety will move you to certain behavior. I think hopefully I'm stating the obvious. So let me just give you a slightly trivial example from, again, my recent experience. So there's someone at church which if I'm honest, I have a little bit of relational tension with, right? So when I saw him one Sunday recently, I found my body beginning to tense up and then my mind becoming fuzzy. But I was thinking to myself, okay, you know, relax, Brian. Don't be so worried, right? Just be a good brother in Christ for this person. And so, you know, we kind of met each other, we walked towards each other, and then he said, you know, a polite good morning to me, right? And then, of course, the obvious thing to do is to say good morning back to him. But after I said good morning to him, then I called him by the wrong name, right? And I was like, and he obviously just looked at me really funnily. And then I just walked away from that and I was just so embarrassed. And I was thinking, oh man, I messed that up again. And so you can see my anxiety led to me behaving in a very stilted and a very artificial manner, right? And of course, I'm sure you can multiply those kind of examples from your own experience. You know, just think about how you behave if you're on a date with a girl that you really like, but it's not going very well. Or if you have a phobia of snakes and you just saw one, right? I think you'll find that your behavior is altered. And often people talk about how you might do three things. You might either freeze, like kind of how like I did. You might flee, or occasionally you might fight, right? So those are some of the typical behavior. I can't pronounce the word behavioral responses to anxiety. So, right, okay, so this is what we've seen so far. We've seen that anxiety is a reaction of the mind, a body and mind. It has a physical impact on you, right? And it also impacts not just your body, but your behavior. But in every situation that I've described so far, we've also seen that there was something that triggered it, isn't it? Right? You know, your anxiety didn't come out of nowhere. So whether it's the train that's coming down hard on you, or whether it's the exam that you think you're not prepared for, or maybe it's the person that you find it hard to get along with, or the date that's not going well, there is something that kind of triggers your anxiety. So you never get anxious over nothing. Your anxiety is always produced by a certain object or a certain situation. Let me just refine that a little bit, right? Now, I think somebody said this in the chat earlier, but it could be even if you have prepared really well for the exam, right? And actually, you know that objectively speaking, you should be prepared for it. You should be fine, right? Sometimes you still have the same reactions, isn't it? You still get anxious even though you're still, objectively speaking, you should be fine. You know, your heart still can't slow down, and so on. And the reason is because it's not just about the situation, but about how you perceive the situation, isn't it? You perceive the situation or the object as something bad, something dangerous, something stressful. So anxiety is not just based on an object or a situation, but also on more precisely on how we perceive or interpret that particular situation, right? So that's how we kind of arrive at that particular definition that we started at the beginning. Yeah, it's a reaction of the mind and body. That's the body and behavior part to a perceived situation that is stressful and dangerous, whether real or imagined. So that's the trigger part. Now, that's how I've described anxiety so far. Does it match with how the Bible describes it? Right? Does this definition match the experience of the Bible? I think so far, I believe that it does. Just turn with me for a moment to Psalm 55, right? And we'll look at this Psalm from time to time throughout this webinar. I'm actually reading from the NIV, so apologies because I realize a lot of you are going to be using the ESV. I've prepared using the NIV. But look at Psalm 55 and just look at verses 2 and then 4 and 5 with me. Here is David, right? And David is actually in the midst of a situation. We don't know the specific circumstances, right? But look at how he reacts to this particular troubling situation that he's in. Notice how his mind and body reacts in verse 2. In verse 2, he says, "My thoughts trouble me, I am distraught." And then down in verse 4, he says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me." So you can see that David's mind and body, they are reacting. And he appears to have heart palpitations of some sort, you know, an accelerated heart rate, chest pain, trembling, all the physical aspects of anxiety. And what is the trigger for his worry? Well, if you look up at verse 3, here we have it, because it says that my thoughts trouble me and I'm distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked. So he's in a situation where he's being threatened by something or somebody. And especially in verses, when we look down at verses 12 to 14, I think I won't read it, but basically in verse 12 to 14, we discover, right, that his perceived enemy is actually a former friend. So it's actually somebody who's betraying him, right? And so you can see that that probably adds to the anxiety of the situation, of how he's feeling. And then as David experiences anxiety, now what does he want to do? Look at verses 6 to 8. Right? In verse 6, he says, I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and storm. Now, to be fair to David, in verses 6 to 8, this is only what he wants to do, not what he actually does, right? And later on in the webinar, we'll see what he does instead. But you can see right now how his anxiety naturally inclines him to behave in a certain way. In this case, it inclines him to want to run away, to flee, right? And so here we have the dynamics of anxiety. There's a trigger, our minds and bodies will produce a physical reaction, and then there is an impulse to behave in a certain way, often to run away. Now, on your outline, you notice that the next two words I put are multifaceted and habitual. And I just want to quickly note a couple of things very quickly. I just want to note, when I put the word multifaceted there, I just wanted to note that our experience of anxiety can be quite complex. I am simplifying it a little bit, but I also just want to recognize that often the reason why we might get anxious could also be due to a whole host of other factors. For example, your family history could play a part because you had a mother who is maybe chronically anxious, or it could be due to you experience a past trauma. So perhaps, for example, if you experience a road accident previously, right? Now that will make you feel more nervous, isn't it? Next time you're in a car or you're crossing the road or something. So just want to note that there are also all these other factors at play that I won't really be acting on, right? And then for habitual, I realized that what I really wanted to say is cyclical. So you can correct that. So I just want to make the basic point that just as anxiety can affect your body and your behavior, the reverse is also true. If you drink too much coffee, you eat too much sugar, and you don't get enough rest or exercise, you're probably more likely to experience the physical symptoms of anxiety as well, right? So that's just all I wanted to say on those particular points. Now, so far, I hope that as we've been working through this definition, and you notice something. You notice where the focus has where the focus has been on so far, right? So far, it's actually been quite focused on the physiological dimension. It's been on kind of our bodies and our reactions, our outward kind of behavior so far, right? But there is something missing from that definition, isn't there, right? It kind of gets at the how of anxiety, but it doesn't quite get at the why of anxiety. Why is it deep down that actually we get anxious? Is it just about the things that we've mentioned so far, right? Now, from a Christian point of view, I think we can say, well, not quite. We can add on another layer, right? And that's what the rest of the webinar is going to be focused on. And we're going to think about what we can call maybe the spiritual dimension. So again, let me just add a quick disclaimer. Remember, I said earlier, just a minute or two ago, that anxiety is multifaceted, right? And so there are sometimes other factors at play. And so sometimes which might mean that, things like medication and that kind of thing might be appropriate, right? But I'm not going to touch on those kind of things, right? So I just want to now focus and think about, especially from a spiritual perspective, right? But I recognize that there can be sometimes medical factors at play as well. Some of you are doctors, you probably know better than I do. Now, what can we add to the definition what can we add to the definition that we've looked at so far, right? Now, on your handout, I put a complementary definition, right? So not so much an alternative definition, but something that just adds a little bit more. And this is what I come up with. Anxiety is the hard response to the uncertainty that we have the ability or resources to cope when faced with a situation that threatens what we value, right? Now, what does this definition add to the earlier definition? You notice that there are some similarities. You know, there are triggers where there's what our response is, but I've kind of added two more things. Firstly, we're no longer talking about the responses of just the body and the mind, but we're talking about the heart, isn't it? Right? The Bible describes the heart as actually the core of our being, right? It's where it's the control center of a person, right? It's where it determines how we think, how we act, how we feel, right? Famously, Jesus says in Mark chapter 7, you know, it's what comes out of a man. What is inside our hearts, our behavior emerges from what is inside our hearts, right? And secondly, I've sort of refined the definition of the trigger a little bit more. I say now that triggers are often things that often threaten what we value. In other words, we don't get anxious if we lose something that has zero value to us, right? So if I have a paper clip and then I just accidentally break it, you know, I don't get worried because the paper clip has zero value to me. But if there's something of value, something that we value that is being threatened, then we will get anxious. And especially if we recognize that we have no ability to be able to do anything about it. So when it is something that we value and we realize that we have no control over it, that's when we get anxious. And that, I think, lies at the heart of anxiety. It's basically when we have something that we value and we lose control, right? Anxiety, I think, at its heart boils down to that loss of control. Now, at this point, let me just make a distinction between concern and anxiety that I find helpful, and it might help to clarify more about what the meaning of what it means to really to be anxious. And I got this from a Christian counselor called Timothy Lane. Now, what is concern? If you live in a neighborhood where there have been many armed robberies recently, you're right to be concerned, right? If your car has not been serviced for a long time and now the engine is making funny noises, you are right to be concerned. And what will you do? Well, an appropriate concern will lead to responsible action. Because what will you do? You'll lock your doors at night, you'll call up your mechanic. So that is concern. Concern will lead you to appropriate action. And godly concern in particular will not only drive you to appropriate action, but to dependence on God, to prayerful dependence on God. Anxiety, I think, as we're talking about here, is the opposite. In a sermon that I preached last year, I suggested that it is when anxiety is when concern gets out of control because we have forgotten that God is always in control. It's when concern gets out of control because we've forgotten that God is always in control. And basically, we want to play God. We want to be the ones in control. Now, I'm aware of the time, so I think I'm not going to spend too much time looking up Romans 1, but basically, I just wanted to make the basic point that often it is when we, at the heart of anxiety, what happens is that often we have lost sight of God, and basically we have exchanged the truth about God for a lie, right? And that's when we start worrying. It's because when we begin to think wrongly, perceive wrongly, and put value on the wrong things. So let me just give some examples of how that might work, right? How distorted thinking or distorted beliefs might contribute to anxiety. And those three things I put on the outline, that's not an exhaustive list. This is just three possible beliefs or thoughts that we might take on, which lead to anxiety, right? So these are some of the things that we might believe, right? At the level of the heart when we get anxious. Number one, we might believe this. I want this, but what if I don't get it, or I lose it if I have it? Now, think about what I said at the beginning of this webinar, right? I said that I was preparing for this webinar, and then I lost the initial work that I did, and then I got anxious. But why did I get anxious? I get anxious because I lost the material. Well, yes, on the surface, that's why I got anxious. But really, the reason why I got anxious goes deeper than that when I probe a little bit further. Is because what I really wanted is I wanted for me to look good to all the participants that I was going to be presenting my material to you guys, right? And when I lost it and I realized that, oh no, I'm not going to have much time to prepare all the stuff again, right? That means I felt that that meant that I wouldn't do a good job presenting this webinar. And therefore, I'm going to lose my reputation. And so that led to me getting anxious. That was kind of the trigger. And that was my heart response to it. And because what I was doing was because I was basically idolizing my reputation. I was idolizing the fact that I wanted to look good before you guys, right? So we can see this dynamic at play in Mark chapter 4, verses 18 to 19. Let me just quickly read that out to you. This is from the parable of the sower, and this is Jesus explaining one of the 4 soils, and he says in verse 18, still others like seed sown among thorns hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful, right? So you can see that there is the deceitfulness of wealth and the worries of this life and the desires for other things. What they've done is they've come and obscured what the word says, which is the word says that I should be worried about the glory of God, about doing this for the purposes of serving my brothers and sisters, kind of, and that is the reason why that leads to anxiety on my part. I think I won't go into James 4, but James 4 is another example where you see this dynamic captured, although in the case of James, it's not so much anxiety that is a primary emotion, but anger. But it's kind of the same kind of process that's happening. Now, in number 2, another belief that I might have is I've got to handle this myself. But what if I can't? So again, another reason why we might get anxious is because we don't trust in God's character. We don't trust in his promises that he'll be there for us. He'll do what is best for us. He'll see us through whatever situation that we're in. So we become control freaks basically when we can't trust God. And so again, I got anxious because when preparing for this webinar, immediately my own thought was, okay, I've got to fix this. I got to try to do this webinar in whatever little time I've got. I've got to handle this myself. I wasn't thinking about praying to God. I wasn't thinking about how I can ask God to help me through this situation. And so the whole well-being of this webinar begins to rest on my shoulders, right? And that's how anxiety works, isn't it? It's when we think that in this situation, whatever situation it is, we've got to kind of fix it ourselves. We've got to control what's going on ourselves, right? But when that happens, it produces great anxiety because we know that we can't do it, right? But we think that we have to carry the weight or the burden of whatever we're facing ourselves. Now, in the Old Testament, one good example where we can see this is in the book of Numbers, 13 to 14. Again, we went the whole thing. Let me just quickly describe to you what's going on in Numbers 13 and 14. And so Israel are on the way to the promised land. In fact, at this point, they're at the edge of the promised land. In 13 verse 1, we are told that we're reminded that this promised land is a gift from God, right? And then as the people, they send some scouts to look through the land, and they notice that it's filled with goodness, filled with good things. The grapes are amazing. It's a land filled with milk and honey. But when the scouts come back, they begin to get anxious. They are fearful because they notice too that in the land there are giants. There are this tribe of people who look really big and scary. And they basically thought, oh man, we've got to handle this ourselves. They had forgotten the promises of God, that God had promised to give them this land, that they would be able to enter this land. But instead, they just saw the giants. They were looking at their circumstances through the eyes of unbelief. They couldn't remember that God had been working through them, working to bring them out of Egypt and had promised for them to enter the promised land. And in fact, they began to complain and they began to tell God, actually, we want to go back to Egypt. They grumbled so much. And so you can see how anxiety works in such a way, how their thoughts and how looking through their situation through the eyes of unbelief, through this belief that they've got to handle this thing themselves, led to them these feelings of anxiety and ultimately to disobedience towards God. And then thirdly, here's another common belief that we might have internalized, which is, I've got to perform. What have I done? And those verses that I put on your outline, right? They're basically verses about, how often we want to be saved by works, right? We go back to depending on our works, but whenever we depend on our works, right, that just doesn't work, right? And that will just simply lead to profound anxiety, because you're never certain if you've never met your own standard or the standard of others sufficiently, right? So when we think we've done enough, we'll be proud. But the moment we dip beneath whatever the expected standard is, right, we get insecure, we get anxious, So often those kind of questions: have I studied enough? Do I know enough? Am I actually good enough? All those kind of things emerge from some of these beliefs that we have in our hearts. So how can I deal with anxiety as a Christian? Now, again, this part is not meant to be comprehensive, right? These are just some suggestions about how we might approach this experience of anxiety. Now, it might sound silly and trite to just say, don't worry, don't be afraid, don't be fearful. But interestingly, that's how the scriptures, that's what the scriptures do repeatedly, again and again. I've given you like a whole range of examples from there on your list, isn't it? Let me just read one from Isaiah 43, verse 5. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I'll bring your children from the east and gather you from the west. And again, you find that this God keeps saying this repeatedly from the beginning to the end of the Bible, right? But is it really that simple? Is it really just a case of, okay, I just need to hear God or my Christian friends say, don't be afraid, and then that's it? I can resolve my anxiety, right? Well, yes and no. It's really, in the end, it comes down to who is it that we fear, right? Why does it comes down to why the Bible says do not be afraid. So here are three things that I want to suggest. Number one, diagnose your anxieties, but don't overdo it. Now, whenever we get anxious, right, we see anxiety as a bad thing, don't we? Oh, I shouldn't be anxious. It's not right. And I'm a Christian. I shouldn't be worried, right? But maybe what we need to do is we need to reframe our thinking and think of anxiety as an opportunity. So instead of feeling bad when you're feeling anxious, see it as an opportunity to think about what is going on inside your heart. So our emotions are often like gauges, they reveal what is actually going on inside our hearts. They reveal what we love, what we value, what we treasure. So whenever we're feeling anxious, it's a good chance to actually take stock and ask, what do these anxieties actually reveal about what I really trust, what I really love, what I really value? What do they reveal about how I perceive or interpret a situation? What do they reveal about what I think about God, right? So think of anxiety as an opportunity, right? But when I say don't overdo it, what I mean by that is simply don't get overly introspective, right? But sometimes some of us, we keep thinking about what do I value, what do I treasure, and then we get more and more anxious if we think that, we can't diagnose our anxieties correctly. So that's what I mean by don't overdo it, right? But instead, let me just quickly move to number two. Let's think about who we fear. Now, the Bible tells us don't be afraid, don't fear. And at first, that suggests that, fear, anxiety, worry is a negative reaction that we should be rid of. But interestingly, the Bible does tell us that actually it is right to sometimes fear, but especially, more specifically, it is right to think about who we fear. And the Bible says that the person that we should fear is actually God himself. You see, whenever we get anxious or fearful of something other than God, our perception of God is actually getting distorted. That means we're actually seeing God as either weak or unable to deal with whatever we're facing, or as uncaring, right? We think he's not concerned. But when we fear God, it means that we are seeing him as he really is, that he's big, he's strong, and he's powerful. Now, just for the remainder of the time, let me just quickly turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. I don't intend to look at this big chunk of the Bible, right? But I just want you to turn to Mark 4, verse 35 to 41. And here Jesus is in the boat with the disciples. And you might remember this story, it's quite a familiar one. And what happens is that there's a storm as they're on the lake. And verse 37 will tell us that the storm is really, really a big one. It's a really desperate situation. You know, the boat is nearly swamped. And in verse 38, the disciples think that they're going to drown. So they're fearful, they're really, really very anxious, right? And beneath their question in verse 38, if you look at verse 38, their question is, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" You know, when we get anxious, that's often our big question, isn't it? Jesus, don't you care about this particular situation? And then, of course, what Jesus does is he gets up and then he steals the storm. But it's interesting. Look at verse 40 and 41. First of all, in verse 40, there's a question now, this time from Jesus. So the first question was from the disciples, do you not care? But in verse 40, now Jesus asks them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have not faith?" And then verse 41, the question is, again from the disciples, "Who is this?" Now they were terrified of the storm earlier. Now they're terrified of this person who is in the boat with them. They're thinking, "My goodness, who is this guy who can steal the storm?" Right? And actually, when we look at chapter 5, all throughout chapter 5, I can see that we won't have time to look through in any detail, right? That is the big question that's running throughout this section of Mark's Gospel, which is, number one, Jesus, do you care? And then Jesus, in all the miracles that he's going to perform, is going to show, right, all right, let's think about who I am really and what your response should be. So for example, in chapter 5, we meet a demon-possessed man who is also in a very desperate situation, right? But again, Jesus heals him, right? And what happens is that when the people around the towns heard about that, they got scared. But for this demon-possessed man, what did he do? He said, he put his faith in Jesus, and then he went to report to the people around him in his surrounding towns who Jesus is. And so what is happening here is that Jesus is showing that he is the one to be rightly feared. And as we look at Jesus, who is the one who is able to calm the storm, able to do all this healing, all these miracles, right? As we contemplate who is Jesus really, right? Then we need to ask, who is it? Who should we fear more? Should we fear our situation more, or should we fear God more? And actually, Jesus says that actually, you need to fear me, but at the same time, you also need to put your faith in me. Why are you so afraid? You still have no faith. And so Jesus is inviting us to put our trust in him. Do you fear the storm, or do you fear Jesus more? And if we look at in Matthew 10, verse 28, we get a similar kind of verse where, again, we recognize that Jesus says, don't fear the one who can only harm your body, but fear the one who can also who can also do stuff to your body and soul. All right, I think we're out of time. Sorry about that. I didn't quite finish my material, but yeah.